Hello and welcome to the first ever Killer Be Killed review and analysis. My name is Scott and I will be your host, your reviewer, your analyst, whatever you want to call me, I am it. So, before we get started, I just want to lay down the structure of how I'm going to organize this video. There's going to be 4 parts, not including this introduction. The first part is going to be the synopsis. The second part is going to be any symbolism that I found throughout the entire film. The third part's going to be any criticisms I have, and the fourth part's going to be my closing thoughts, which will include my numerical review of the film. And before I get started with the synopsis, I just want to warn you guys that there's going to be a lot of spoilers. I'm going to be going through the ending and just pretty much the entirety of the film, for lack of a better word, I guess. So if you haven't seen this film, I highly suggest that you watch it before watching this review. Spoiler, it's a pretty good film, and I think that you shouldn't be robbed of your first time experience watching it. I think it's a good film. I think, for the most part, we'll dig into it later, my more in-depth thoughts about it, but it's still a good film, and I think you should experience it without having anything spoiled for you. So The Daughter is a 2015 Australian dramatic tragedy directed by Simon Stone, and it's based on the novel The Wild Duck by Henrik Ibsen. I apologize if I'm butchering that pronunciation. It's worth noting that I have not read The Wild Duck, so I can't really review the movie in that sort of context and how relevant or how close it is to that novel. But anyways, I'll try the best I can to review it with what I do know. So, the movie starts out from Christian's perspective, who is our really main character, quote unquote. He's probably the most major, prolific character throughout the entirety of the film, and he's come to town from America to attend his father's wedding. Christian's father, Henry, is marrying his 31-year-old housekeeper/maid, Anna, and it's worth noting that although I described this scene or sequence of Christian coming to his old hometown in Australia, this is not technically the very beginning of what happens in the timeline of this movie. The very beginning of this movie starts as Henry shoots and wounds a duck he was hunting, but instead of putting it out of its misery, he transfers the possession of the duck to Walter, who is going to look after and take care of this duck. I just figured that I should clear that up. That's technically the beginning of the story, being that it was, but it's technically not of importance until later on in the film. So not too long later, Christian runs into his old friend Oliver at the grocery store, and Oliver invites him to have dinner with his family. Christian accepts and completely forgets about his prior obligation of having a dinner with Henry and his fiancée Anna. And at this dinner, Christian meets all of Oliver's family, comprised of his daughter Hedvig, who is in her middle to late teens. He also meets his father, Walter, who I described earlier as the man who took the duck to, take care of it and whatnot. He also meets his wife, Charlotte. So nothing really substantial happens until they go on to a camping trip, in which there is dialogue exchange that reveals that Charlotte, Oliver's wife, is the former housemaid of Henry. So the next day rolls along and Christian has some obvious questions, and he questions Charlotte about, how long ago did she work for Henry and why she left and whatnot. And it's at this point that Christian realizes and understands that Charlotte is the woman that Henry first had an affair with back when his mother was still alive. So then Christian goes to question Henry about Charlotte, in which they have an obvious dispute, and it is then revealed that yes, Charlotte is the woman that Henry had an affair with when Christian's mother was still alive. It is then revealed through dialogue that this may have led to Christian's mom's eventual suicide. However, through dialogue that is said by Henry, we can infer that this might not be all that caused it. It seemed like she might have had some demons. She might have suffered from postpartum depression or something like that. We're not even told how old Christian was when she committed suicide. So really all we have to go on is that this could have been the straw that broke the camel's back in her mental health state. So after it is revealed that Charlotte is Henry's ex-mistress, it really goes all downhill for all of these characters regarding their situations and events that correspond with them. For example, it is revealed that Christian is a struggling alcoholic who has been on a break with his wife Grace. Grace is supposed to be meeting Christian at this wedding to support him. He goes to the airport to meet her with flowers and she never shows up. and then in a future conversation it is revealed that Grace has been cheating on him with a man named Richard, and that their entire marriage is over. This essentially sends Christian on an emotional rampage where he then has a strong bitterment towards the entire world and just everything about his life. Another example would be Hedwig and her boyfriend Corey. I believe his name's Corey, I don't really remember. He's not all that important to the story, so it's kind of whatever. But essentially Corey has to leave because of the wood mill that is owned by Henry, Christian's father. It's shutting down and everyone's losing their jobs in the town, and Corey has to move out of town because his father found a new job. And this effectively ends the relationship between Corey and Hedwig. As the story rolls on, Henry and Anna's wedding approaches, with Christian in a completely crippled emotional state because of the situation that just happened between him and Grace. Oliver's family, including Hedwig and his wife Charlotte, are attending this wedding. Christian and Oliver get very drunk, and then Christian makes the very bad decision of telling Oliver about what happened between Charlotte and his father, Henry. Oliver then gets extremely upset and then punches Henry in the middle of the dance floor, which is pretty amazing, and then he storms off into the parking lot area with Charlotte then chasing him. Charlotte and Oliver have a confrontation, and it is then revealed that Hedwig is actually Henry's biological daughter and not Oliver's. Obviously, this then emotionally destroys Oliver, and then he leaves the entire wedding on barefoot, drunken, wandering into the open, woodsy kind of area. Charlotte then makes her way back to the dance floor area and runs into Christian, in which Christian says something along the lines of, "I'm sorry," and she says, "You're disgusting." At this point in time, all I can think is, hey, you just kinda caused the death of his mom. I don't think you're the one here who should be making judgmental statements such as, "You're disgusting." I mean, don't get me wrong, what Christian did probably wasn't the best thing in hindsight, but still, you have literally no room to be criticizing him, not any of his ethics. So the next day comes along and Oliver is completely gone. He's essentially ran away, and no one has any means of communicating with him except his father when he calls him and asks him for new clothes and whatnot. Hedwig's then obviously extremely confused about the whole situation and what's going on, but she has to go to school, and that's what she does. And her mom, who is a substitute teacher at the school, gets called in to substitute teach for Hedwig's class. In the middle of Hedwig's class, Hedwig basically flat out asks her, "Did you cheat on Dad?" And she's completely ignoring her questions, and the entire class is laughing, and then Hedwig says, "I hate you," and storms off and leaves. Charlotte calls after her, but Hedwig doesn't listen, and then she goes then to visit her dad at the hotel motel thing that he's staying at. Oliver isn't there, but Christian is, and Hedwig and Christian have a weird conversation, which then involves in Hedwig asking Christian if he wants to have sex with her. And this is not just weird on an incest level, but it's also weird on an age level. Christian obviously backs off and is like, no, you just don't understand. Then Hedwig asks him what's going on, and then Christian tells Hedwig the truth about who her real father is. It's important to note that Christian gives kind of a wry smile when Hedwig asks the truth of the situation that's going on. It kind of shows that he's not doing this because, he's some advocate for the truth. It shows that he's gaining enjoyment out of the sadness and the emotional destruction of others because he himself is emotionally destructed. Destructed? That's not a word. But hopefully you get what I mean. He's been basically completely deprived of happiness, and now he gets enjoyment from depriving others of the same happiness. Many people at this point would consider Christian as the villain of the story, but I don't see it that way. He's been basically dealt a really bad hand in life. He did pretty much all he could do in regards to both his childhood and how he is as an adult to achieve some sort of happiness, but he keeps getting denied it. So at this point, he just has this really bitter resentment of the world, and he basically says, "If I can't be happy, you can't be happy." Hedwig then confronts Oliver, but he wants absolutely nothing to do with her. He doesn't want to see her, and he flat out tells her that. And you can kind of compare this situation to the situation between Catelyn Stark and Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. Hedwig, such as Jon Snow, are completely innocent to their entire circumstance and situation. However, the parent, in this case Catelyn and Oliver, they understand that they are innocent to the situation, but they just can't get over the fact that they are this image of betrayal, and they cannot see past that. I like to point out that the scene is extremely powerful and well portrayed by the actor who played Hedwig and the actor who played Oliver. The emotion there is very real and raw, and you can feel like it's actually happening and that it's very genuine. If there was one standout performance, scene, or scenario that went down, it would be this one. We then find Hedwig in a little rescue forest that her grandfather Walter has built, and she then takes the duck that he had saved and basically forces it to fly, in which a few times it fails to, and then finally it does succeed in flying. It's important to note that this duck is forced to fly. It does not fly naturally on its own, but rather Hedwig throws it into the air and it essentially has to fly to survive. Hedwig then takes her grandfather's shotgun and heads to the abandoned wood factory where her and Corey had previously shot cans with said shotgun. Hedwig is then shown in this rusted car that her and Corey had been in before. The camera then pans to Hedwig's face and a gunshot is heard as Walter quickly approaches. The next scene then shows Oliver race into the hospital as he is clearly distraught over the news of his daughter's attempted suicide. Through dialogue, we learn that Oliver is very upset about his actions and rejecting his daughter Hedwig. And it's important to note that Oliver now sees Hedwig as his daughter, despite what any biological truth may say. The movie concludes as the doctor meets with Hedwig's parents and she tells them that Hedwig is still in critical condition and they don't know whether or not she will survive. Endings like these tend to bother some people, but personally I don't mind the you decide quote-unquote endings. I personally feel that there could have been a stronger ending to this story, but I don't think it's a weak ending either. Alright, so now that we're done with the synopsis, we're going to move on to the symbolism now. So the most obvious symbol in the story is the duck. Hal gets shot down by Henry and is then cared for and looked after by Walter and his family, and is then kind of forced to take flight and become its past self in a sort of sense when Hedwig tosses it up in the air in her fit of despair. So from my point of view, the duck stands for two things. One, it stands for basically what's going on in the story, and it's symbolic of Henry's actions and how they negatively affect the other characters in the story. And two, it basically just stands for the perseverance and dealing with conflict in life in just a broad sense. So how it affects the story, basically, if you break everything down, all of the conflict, all of the tragedy, the domino effect of just despair on each and every character throughout the entire story, it all breaks down to Henry's basically original sin in cheating on his wife, Christian's mom, with Charlotte. I mean, you can definitely argue that Christian escalated the situation by telling Oliver the truth and then subsequently telling Hedwig the truth, but really, if you think about it and you break it down, that wouldn't have had to have happened had Henry not committed, the first sin and basically just started this entire domino effect of tragedy. And so on a broad spectrum, on the second point of view that I see the symbolism of the duck as, basically the duck represents pretty much anybody and everybody in a sort of sense, and how it can just kind of get shot down just out of the blue. The duck doesn't know what's coming, but just conflict hits it, but it just needs to keep persevering. It heals day by day by day, and eventually it'll grow strong enough to be its past self, but there's still that lasting memory, that scar that had happened, and it actually causes it to grow stronger. Well, not necessarily grow stronger, but it learns from the entire situation and it builds upon that. Furthermore, I see the story itself as being very quote-unquote symbolic. I don't know if, say, symbolism is the best word to describe it, but the story itself has a very theatrical element to it. It feels very much as like a Shakespearean-esque play that's unfolding in front of us. You have Henry and Christian's family, which is kind of like the upper class, the high class side of the spectrum, and then you have Oliver and his family, which are the lower class. And even though they experience this despair and this conflict and this tragedy in different sort of ways, they're both still experiencing it. I mean, even Henry, who is essentially the villain of the story, experiences tragedy himself. I mean, he basically started the entire, like I said, metaphorically speaking, the domino effect of tragedy throughout the entire story. He still experiences that tragedy himself. His entire wedding, which is supposed to be a happy time for him, has basically just become this sinkhole of just family conflict and just ultimate sorrow. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to turn Henry into a martyr here, but I'm just saying he still experiences this tragedy himself. And I would even argue that Christian is probably one of the more devastated characters in the entire movie, probably only second behind Oliver. As I mentioned in the synopsis, Christian goes through all of this anguish, and it basically pushes himself to this point where he no longer cares about morality or about anyone else, and actually gains enjoyment from the despair and the anguish and the sadness of other people, including those he loves. Although I would argue that he probably doesn't really love them that much anymore, considering he likes watching them grovel and experience the same pain as he is experiencing. As a whole, though, the daughter doesn't really have that much sociological criticisms or just overall perspective altering symbolism or meanings to push onto the audience, except for maybe, that one little tidbit that I talked about with the duck and perseverance. As a whole, as I mentioned earlier, the daughter feels more like a experience, like a theatrical play-like experience that you're just supposed to sit through and enjoy in the darkest sense of the word, instead of necessarily take out any sort of meanings or lessons from the movie. And that's not necessarily a criticism on the movie either, it's just kind of a fact. Not every film has to portray some sort of deeper meaning or philosophical anomaly to the audience, if you know what I mean. Speaking of criticisms, let's move on to that. Criticisms! Yeah! So before we move on to my criticisms on the movie, I'd first like to address some other criticisms that I've just found people to have with the film. So the main major criticism that I've seen is that it's not very accessible. It's very dark, very dreary, very tragic. There is little to no reprieve or relief throughout the entirety of the film. In fact, I can't even remember a single line that has any sort of comic relief to the entire situation that's going down. And so because of this, a lot of people who aren't into, quote-unquote, artsy films, or just aren't very exploratory, if that's a word, I hope that's a word, in the film industry, and they're just kind of casual movie watchers. People like that seem to react negatively to the film, for obvious reasons too. I'm not necessarily blaming those people. I'm just kind of, for argument reasons, agreeing with them, I guess. This film's not going to appeal to everybody. It's going to appeal to a very niche market. And I, personally, happen to be a part of that niche market who do find the film enjoyable. As for my own criticisms on the film, I actually don't really have many. If there is one major criticism I could make, it's that the film is a little bit predictable. Back when we first learned that Charlotte was Henry's former maid and his former mistress, I said to myself, Hedwig's probably going to end up being Henry's biological daughter and not Oliver's, and sure enough, that came true. And just in general throughout the film, there's not really any mind-blowing, completely out of left field situations or any dialogue or any conflict or anything like that that really made a big impact on me. The only other semi-major criticism that I have about the movie that I mentioned earlier in the synopsis is that I think the ending could have been done a bit better. Although I'm not really all that upset about how they ended it, I feel like it would have been better for them to create a definitive ending where Hedwig does end up dying, just because I feel like that would have really kind of been the icing on the cake and kind of plant its feet in the ground as this abysmal tragedy that it had been portraying itself as numerous times throughout the rest of the movie. I will say, though, that I would prefer this you choose quote-unquote ending rather than them making a definitive ending where Hedwig does end up living, because as I said, just regarding how depressive and how sad this movie is throughout the entirety, I feel like it would have kind of just lost its impact had there been, a storybook happy ending to it. So my final criticism is a very, very minor one that doesn't even impact the story in any sense, and that criticism is the name of the movie. I feel like this entire story is more than just Hedwig, it's more than just the daughter, it's more than just Henry's daughter, it's more than just Oliver's daughter. I feel like this entire story is about both families and each and every character. I don't feel like the entire story is pinpointed to one exact character and their entire dilemma and their conflict. I would have preferred them to maybe name the movie after like The Town or something like that. In fact, I can't even remember the name of the town. I don't think they even said it. I apologize if I'm completely wrong on that, but even thinking back to the very beginning of the film when Henry had announced that the wood factory would be closing. One of the workers shouted out, "So you're just gonna give up on this town?" And he didn't really even say the name. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I just can't for the life of me remember the name of it. And personally, I just feel like it would have been better to call it that, or maybe even just something else. The names of the families, maybe. I don't know. I just kind of feel like The Daughter is way too specific for how unspecific the film is. So now we're going to move on from criticisms and go on to my closing thoughts. I probably should have created a separate section for my praises, my good jobs towards the film, but it's a little too late to change it, so whatever. So I'll just start with the casting. I thought the casting was really good. I thought the acting was really good. The story writing is good for the most part, except for, like I said, it's a little bit predictable at sometimes. I thought the setting was very strong. I really liked the kind of Australian backwoods kind of small town theme they had going on. I also just like how dark the film is, and it's kind of refreshing to have this sort of darkness, I guess, in an ironic sense. Movies nowadays seem to be so storyboard, happy ending, especially in dramas. And to see a movie like this kind of go along the route more of, like I said, Shakespearean theater-esque tragedy is just really refreshing. It's a nice change of pace. I also thought the cinematography was quite good. It was shot very well, no issues with that. I'd kind of like to reference back to the synopsis when I was talking about when Christian was talking to Hedwig and telling her the truth about who her real father is. And I mentioned how Christian gives kind of a wry smile when speaking to her. That was very, very, very well executed, very masterfully done by the director. And it kind of gives us insight into Christian's true character and his true intentions in the film. All in all, I thought it was a pretty good film. I would recommend it to someone, but I would be very cautious when recommending it to someone. As I mentioned earlier, it's not all that accessible of a movie. It's very much a film lover's movie, and not necessarily all good movies have to be accessible to the general public. As for a numerical rating, I would give it an 8.5, 8.5 out of 10. The reason why it's not bumped up to a 9 is just because it didn't really wow me. I mean, it's still a good movie. It's just at the end, I wasn't like, flustered. Oh my god, this was beautiful. This was amazing. I mean, I felt like my time was put to good use, but I wasn't necessarily flabbergasted at the quality and the brilliance of the film. So that about does it for my review and analysis of The Daughter. I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video. Feel free to leave any suggestions in the comments. I'm always down for any constructive criticism. And yeah, if you like the video, hit the like button. If you dislike the video, please let me know, see what I can do to maybe do better in the future. Otherwise, that's about it. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Hello and welcome to the first ever Killer Be Killed review / analysis. My name is Scott, and I will be your host, your reviewer, your analyst. That is the word I am looking for. Analyst. So The Daughter is a 2015 Australian dramatic tragedy. I cannot talk. Whoa. At this dinner, Christian meets all of Oliver's family. Comprised of... At this dinner, Christian meets all of Oliver's family, which is comprised of Hedwig, his daughter... Hedwig. Oh my god. When they're all camping together, having fun, chit-chatting, and throwing sauce at each other. I don't know if that's an expression, but I'm using it. And she tells them that Hedwig is his parents, and she tells them that Hedwig is still in critical... Why can I not fucking speak? The movie concludes as the doctor meets with Hedwig's parents, and she tells them that the Hedwig, oh my god. So that about does it from my review and analysis of The Daughter. I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video. Feel free to leave any suggestions in the